Well, another lecture on Rome, and I'm going to try to explain the Roman Republic a little more fully, and then kind of look at the causes behind the end of the Republic and the establishment of the imperial system. But I won't do that all today. I will do that in a series of lectures. I will end today with the rise of Gaius Marius. And I think there's much to talk about. So let's start. Again, the Republic was established in 509 BCE, as we talked about last time. It was established after the Romans overthrew the Etruscan king, Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud. There is an old legend that the Romans took to heart about the end of the Republic, and that is the rape of Lucretia. It seems that the Romans believed that the son of Tarquin the Proud uh, was taken aback by the claims of the Romans that their women were much more moral and upstanding than Etruscan women. And there was a wager of some kind where the group around Tarquin, both Roman and Etruscans, went around the city and peered into the homes of Etruscan families to see how the women, the Etruscan women, were behaving, and invariably they found that the Etruscan women were living the high life, being immoral, committing adultery, drinking, and behaving in ways that were uh, really out of step with Roman morality or morality itself. Then they peered in at the home of a Roman elite and his wife Lucretia, who was behaving impeccably. Morally, she was at the spinning wheel, spinning wool and cloth for the family, taking care of the household, being upright and righteous. And as a result, Tarquin's son became enamored of Lucretia or wanted to corrupt her. And he showed up later uh, and proceeded to rape her. And he basically saying that he would kill her and a slave, and then would charge the slave and Lucretia with having an adulterous affair, and her reputation would be uh, destroyed that way. Lucretia then submitted to the rape, and later on, when her husband and uh, a friend showed up, and this friend is very important. He's the Brutus that establishes the Republic uh, and becomes the first consul. Show up. They're told by Lucretia what had happened, and then she, in order to kind of confirm her story, she commits suicide. This has such a strong hold on the Romans that they then call upon the Roman populace to rise and overthrow uh, Tarquin the Proud, or Tarquinius Superbus. They overthrow him, drive him out, and establish the republic. From that point on, the idea of a king is just basically unacceptable to the Romans. Uh, and they proceed to create a republic where no one individual can hold absolute power, and establish a system where all political offices have collegiality, that is, there are more than one, and they're also constrained by briefness of tenure. They're elected generally for 1 year, with one exception, all officers are elected for 1 year. There is one exception to that rule on a continuing basis, and there's another exception in times of emergency. And the officers I've listed here, you have two consuls elected for 1 year. Each colleague could veto the other, and chief executive officer, and they were the chief executive officers and military commanders of the Roman Republic, and they held as close to absolute power as you could under the Roman system, but it wasn't absolute, of course, because of collegiality and again the briefness of tenure. The next, the most important office was the praetorship, praetors. They were also elected 1 year, and each had veto power. They were legal officers. They were judges, and they would annually state Roman law. They would set precedent for Roman courts. These were very, very important offices in the Roman Republic. And both the consuls and the praetors, after serving their 1 year, could enter the Senate and would be available, would be named in most cases to administer a province of the Roman state, that is a province of the Roman Empire, because one has to understand the Roman Republic was an imperial republic. It conquered territory, it established provinces. Rome was imperial before it became a system ruled by an emperor. Under the Republic, you had provinces, and both consuls and praetors would serve after their term ended, would serve as governors in these offices. And they would hold the imperium of the office, which included immunity from public prosecution. It was only when those terms, both their official terms in office and their terms as governors of the republic's provinces ended, that they could be tried. The next office is the quaestors, which were the junior offices in the Roman Republic, and there was 1 year again. There were fiscal officers. They held they collected the taxes, administered the treasury, served in a fiscal fashion. These were these most junior offices in the Roman system. And by the way, all these offices were associated with the Senate. But they were the most junior offices in what the Romans called the course of honor, or the cursus honorum, which was basically the political careers that each Roman elite was expected to pursue during their lives. The quaestors, the office just above quaestors were the aediles, and they had 1 year. Again, they administered the services of the city. They generally were responsible for the gains, for some of the police activities, as infrequent as those were, and safety measures that were needed for the city. They also made sure that the sewers were taken care of, the water supply, food supply, and so on. So these were very, very important. And they also held games, which made them very, very popular officers, if they could certainly hold these games, which were part of the Roman system. The next office, and this is an office that had more than 1 year. It was a staggered system. About every year and a half, censors were elected. So it was staggered over 3 years. that they served. They were responsible for the census, and they could censor things. So this is where the word censor comes from. They could censor public morality, and they also held the census, so they could actually trim the membership in the Senate. They could kick out senators that had behaved immorally or were not wealthy enough to be part of the Roman Senate. And then the last office is, of course, dictator. And there's 6 months, full power to deal with emergency, but nothing else. An emergency had to arise. The dictators were chosen to deal with that emergency. They had full power, absolute power to deal with that emergency, but they could deal with nothing else. So this was a constitutional office, and it was quite important, and later on would gain greater and greater importance as this constitutional system of the republic fell apart. Okay. Okay. The plebeian assemblies I've already mentioned. They were created in for the during the the conflict of the orders, and these are the events that the plebeians gain, where the plebeians gained their representatives systems and bodies. Being very important in 494, you have the establishment of the tribunes of the plebs, and the 450, the 12 tablets of law, and of course then in 287, the Lex Hortensia, as we discussed before, declared the plebeian assemblies as the supreme legislative bodies with power over all Romans, and deprived the Senate of any official legal authority. And this was the system that was set up. As I said, the 2 consuls, the praetors, the quaestors, I put them here basically to define their authority and their terms of office. The Senate had about 300 members. It was an advisory council, power to approve the laws until 287. And it required that you have an annual income of 800,000 sesterces, and it also required military service. It's very, very unusual for Romans to allow those people without military service and wealth, both, to serve in that capacity. Again, in before 133, the tribal assemblies of the plebs deferred to the Senate and never voted against the Senate's legislative initiative. Roman politics deferred to seniority and tradition. It was very much a system of deference and hierarchy. The mons maiorum, the way of the elders, gravitas, auctoritas, right, legitimate power, pietas, duty, right, piety was duty, and seriousness, legitimate power, duty, important principles that were expected to be exemplified by all Romans. The assemblies were generally recognized the importance of tradition, elites, and hierarchy, and therefore always deferred to the Senate. That is until 133, when things began to change. As I mentioned this before, this was basically the system, the way that they worked. And again, it was an electoral system, which almost always supported the interest of the elite. And legally, it was structured so it would support the elites. The tribunes. There were 10 tribunes elected yearly with the power to veto any law or act of government, regardless of source. This is the only office that was not associated with the Senate. They could convoke a meeting of the assemblies, empowered to initiate legislation in the assemblies. Tribunes had to be plebeian. Tribunes before Gaius Gracchus in 133 BCE deferred to the Senate and the traditions of Rome, never initiated conflicting legislation. That changed with Gracchus. The causes for the fall of the Republic. Clearly, Roman imperial wars. There were 3 Punic wars against Carthage from 264 to 147, 148 BCE. And the concurrent wars against the Hellenistic kingdoms, basically generally around the same time, both destroyed the small land-owning class and generating mass migration into cities while bringing in wealth and new opportunities for elites. Now, that destroyed the balance of political power in Rome by basically destroying the small landowning class, small landowning. Not that the class was small, the class was rather large, but they held small plots of land, and they were destroyed by the Roman system, which required that landowners participate in war. That those Roman citizens who had wealth participated at different levels and had different obligations to the defense of Rome in foreign wars. These wars, as you can see, lasted over 100 years, and there were 2 theaters of wars fought during this time. So there were landowners who had to abandon their land over generations. They lost this land as a result of economic factors, and they returned as landless groups, which crowded into the cities and pressured political institutions for recourse. That is, a land reform and social welfare and legislation that would succor their new conditions. By the same token, the amount of wealth that Rome was able to extract from its provinces as a result of a conquest, which took place in a very short time, because although this is over a 100-year period, it is really a short time to establish as large an empire, that is the whole Mediterranean basin, that Rome was able to conquer. And it was really a wonder to many who were viewing this. But it produced a great deal of wealth, which strengthened the elites, and it offered the opportunities to new elites who then kind of marched on to conquer new territories and look for ways that they could exploit these territories, usually through tax farming and extraction of natural resources, and establishing an unbalanced trade relationship with these colonies or these provinces. As a result, you had the rise, as a result of this imperial growth in a very short time, and the factors I've just mentioned, you had the rise of popular generals and armies made up from the landless. So at some point in Roman history, and we'll talk about the Marian reforms, the reforms of Gaius Marius, in about 109 BCE, the reforms of Gaius Marius changes the Roman military system from one that was based on the citizen soldier, whose wealth determined their respective obligations to Roman Roman military, to one that was a professional military, where soldiers were trained by very popular and dynamic generals who then wielded together armies that were not loyal to the Roman Republic, but to the generals themselves. And this began to undercut the strength of the Roman Republic. And then you finally had the emergence of two political factions, the populares, those who sided with land reform, debt relief, social reform, and the primacy of popular assemblies against the Senate, and the optimates, or boni, the best men, an aristocratic faction that supported the mons maiorum, the traditional forms, and the role of the Senate. These two parties split on land reform, debt relief, right, forgiveness of debt, social reform, and the primacy of the popular assemblies against the Senate was the most important factor. That is, they basically sided with tribunes generally, who were able to pass legislation on land reform, debt relief, and such without first submitting it to the Senate for the Senate's approval. So they broke with the traditions that had lasted for over 100 years, where about 400 families ruled the whole thing. The the optimates, on the other hand, the boni, basically wanted to retain the Senate's role. That is, the Senate had to be the first stop for any legislation, and the Senate had to approve that legislation before it could go to the popular assemblies, where they would just rubber stamp the Senate's decision or the Senate's point of view. This was the fault line of the Roman political system. If you supported the popular assemblies against the Senate, that is the primacy of the popular assembly against the Senate, you were populares. If you sided with the traditional forms that required the Senate to give its advice and consent before legislation could be approved, then you were a optimates. These two factions would have a continuing role in what became the Roman Revolution, starting in 133 with the year in office of Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus as tribune of the plebs. Just wanted to show you how Rome expanded very quickly. You can see the wars against Carthage. Its expansion was, of a remarkable extent. And you can see then the Punic Wars ended in 146, and then Caesar death in 44. By that time, Rome had extended its reach into Gaul, what is today France, Belgium, and parts of Western Germany, and was able to take territory later on Egypt, as you can see, Syria, Judea, which were taken in the 60s BCE under Pompey. But you can see a remarkable amount of growth, and this just strained the institutions of the Republic to a breaking point, as we shall see. The first general that emerges in this process, where you have very, very popular generals that kind of eclipse the public institutions, the political institutions of the Roman Republic, is Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. He's the man who defeated Hannibal Barca in the Second Punic War. Second Punic War is from 218 to 202, 201. Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in 202, and then went on to defeat some of the Hellenistic kingdoms in the east, along with his brother. He became larger than life. He began to eclipse the Senate, and individuals in the Senate moved against him eventually. They were afraid that Scipio's stature in the Punic and Hellenistic wars would allow him to overthrow the collegial and revolving leadership system, and he would be able to gather unto himself absolute power, that of a king, and which was anathema to the Roman system. That is the idea of a king. So he and his brother were hounded by the senatorial opposition, and after losing the imperium and immunity of office, they forced Scipio into exile. Actually, Scipio was brought up on charges. He refused to answer them, thinking that his service to Rome had answered them fully. As a result, he then accepted voluntary exile from Rome, and he died in exile. But Scipio would be avenged by his biological grandsons, the Gracchi. Okay, so this is basically from Polybius. This is book 17. I've mentioned Polybius before. Polybius was a Greek who was taken hostage in the Hellenistic wars against the Greeks. And he was treated as an honored guest by Scipio's family, the Scipiones. He was then associated with Scipio's adopted grandson, Scipio Aemilianus, who was the man who finally finished off Carthage in the Third Punic War, and also defeated some of the Hellenistic kingdoms and brought an end to the Third Iberian War in Spain, and who saw the first glimpses of the career of Gaius Marius in Spain. But Polybius was a Greek writer, Greek historian, who looks at the rise of Rome and wants to explain it. He was very critical of the Senate attacking Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, that is the adoptive grandfather of his patron, Scipio Aemilianus. But he also saw in Rome a great resiliency, because he saw in the Roman political system a great deal of flexibility. That is, he argued that Rome had incorporated the different elements of political power in a balanced fashion that allowed Rome to pursue goals over time in a very efficient way, and also to integrate the different elements in Roman society fully in the pursuit of those goals. But as you can see here, he's talking about how Scipio Africanus was hounded by the Roman Senate. And Roman political control methods and goals. The Roman constitution under the Republic, after the Lex Hortensia in 287 BCE, established the popular assemblies as the legal ruling institutions and denied the Senate legal standing, relied on three layers of political control. First, the electoral system in the centuries and the tribal assembly of the plebs was dominated legally by the Roman elite. So legally, the Romans could wield power very effectively by using the very structure, the very legal structure of these popular assemblies. That is, the electoral system that was created, that basically sided with the interest of the elite in a legal in their very legal structures. That is, each tribe voted as a group, each century voted as a group, and in the centuries, you had the wealthier groups controlled the vast majority of centuries. So there were 193 centuries, and over 100 of them, which was the majority, was controlled by the wealthiest 10% of the Roman people. So that gave them a great deal of power. The tribal assembly was less controlled by the Roman elite, but it was still, it favored the interest of the wealthy. Although that would change over time as larger groups began to concentrate in the urban tribes, and they began to press for political change. So, secondly, no legislation was to be taken up by the assemblies without first obtaining senatorial approval, and could only be introduced by Senate officers. That is, consuls and praetors were the only ones that could introduce legislation, and it had to be introduced to the Senate for their approval before it could go on to the popular assemblies. That wasn't a legal condition, but that was a condition of tradition. Tradition called for that process to be followed. And then finally, should all else fail, and it never did between 287 and 133. So these things worked without having recourse to violence or anything else. But the Romans could exert another layer of control through the patron-client relationship. It linked all social groups together in an informal but binding reciprocal hierarchy. I like to call it the Godfather method. If you've seen the Godfather movie, the first one, by the way, I think the finest American movie ever made, you see how Vito Corleone is holding a session during his daughter's wedding, or before his daughter's wedding. Well, I guess it's in the reception, where he is taking requests from individuals, and these individuals are making various requests, and he is complying with them, although they understand that should he need their services, they are to give them in kind of reciprocity, that they are bound to a client-patron relationship. And that relationship really held together the Roman system. At the very basic level, it was all about the patron and the client. Clients would ask for things that they required, and patrons would comply, but always with the understanding that the client would have to reciprocate should the patron call him for services. The Roman constitutional system combined what German sociologist Max Weber argued there were three types of power: legal, traditional, and charismatic. Although Weber suggests that the three types were not mutually exclusive and the system can combine several, the Romans did. This was not just one, but all three kind of were blending together and combining to create a very flexible but very, very sturdy Roman political system. The legal power was primarily vested in the electoral system of the popular assemblies. Traditional power was largely wielded by the Senate's role in advising and consenting to and proposing legislation, although it lacked legal authority. Remember, that was the Senate's consent and advice was not legally required, but it was traditionally based method of passing legislation or uh, establishing norms. And then charismatic power is mainly displayed by the patron-client relation network, where people chose clients and clients chose patrons, and a charismatic power, charismatic hold was mainly responsible for that network, for holding together the network. So the populares versus optimates. A key issue of conflict between these two factions was whether legislation could be directly introduced by the popular assemblies without first receiving informal but necessary Senate approval. The populares favored this process using the tribunes, while the optimates condemned it as a violation of traditional norms and an attack on the republic, charging their foes with seeking to reestablish monarchy. And this began the process that it has come to be defined as the Roman Revolution. The Gracchi. So Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, together known as the Gracchi, the grandsons of Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, by his widely admired daughter Cornelia, another of these Roman women who have a greater than life, a larger than life role in the Roman tradition. She raised her children. She came from a well-known, prominent family. She married a man who did not provide her the same kind of wealth. And when she was asked where was her fortune, in a kind of derogatory fashion, she basically looked at Tiberius and Gaius and said, "These are my jewels," which was a response widely admired by the Romans. The Romans were very, very much family oriented, and they saw the role of Roman women as guarantors of family life as a very, very important element in their society. So when Tiberius Gracchus, Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus wins um, the tribuneship in 133 for 1 year. He is a veteran of the Roman wars. He serves in Spain in the Iberian Wars under Scipio Aemilianus, and he is disgusted by the state of that middle class Roman landowning group, which is decimated by the more than 100 years of war that precede 133. That end with the defeat of both the Hellenistic kingdoms and Carthage about 147, 146. And Plutarch describes Tiberius as wanting to succor the Roman landowning class that has now become homeless. And he cites a speech by Tiberius Gracchus, where he basically associates these people as, you know, basically lower than the wild beasts. That the wild beasts that roam, that live around Rome, live better than than those who have fought for Rome. As you can see in this statement, Plutarch argues that Tiberius intends to change the Roman system by passing legislation, land reform legislation that is quite important. Tiberius is able to pass this legislation by threatening to shut down government through the tribune's veto. When the Senate finds another tribune to veto Tiberius's actions, Tiberius basically uses the popular assemblies to intimidate that tribune and force the passing of land reform legislation. He's able to do that effectively. And then by using actually wealth that is given to the Romans by King Attalus of Pergamum, who dies childless and basically bequeaths his immense fortune to the Roman people. Tiberius passes legislation where he's able to buy land from the Oger Publica, the public lands, to give to the homeless in Rome by using this wealth that has come to be given to Rome. So Tiberius does this. He then does something that is completely unexpected and breaks tradition, and that is he seeks immediate re-election. Romans prohibited immediate re-election, not through law, but basically tradition, very much like George Washington not seeking as a third term, and then each successive president, until it was constitutionally mandated, until two terms were constitutionally mandated, most presidents did not seek a third term. In fact, no presidents sought a third term because of the traditions established by George Washington. So similarly, there was a traditional prohibition against the seeking of immediate reelection. Tiberius broke with that president, and then he won the tribuneship again. At that point, he was charged with seeking to become a king, and the senatorial elite then used their clients to stage a riot in the Forum, the center of Roman political life, and killed Tiberius and hundreds of his followers. Blood had been spilled in the Roman Revolution. These are the Gracchi, Tiberius and Gaius Sempronius Gracchus, together known as the Gracchi. Gaius Gracchus, elected tribune in 122, so a decade after his brother, Gaius Gracchus followed his other brother's leader of the Populares and enacted a more extensive land reform using his veto and the popular assemblies. He also won immediate re-election, so he basically followed almost exactly the pattern set by his older brother. As a result, the frustrated senatorial elite once again resorted to violence. They provoked a riot in a forum which Gaius and thousands of populares were massacred. The Roman Revolution waited for a military crisis. That would be the next step. And the leadership of a capable and charismatic general, the populares would find one in the consequential and controversial Gaius Marius, a little less than a decade later. So I'm going to stop here with the end of the career of the Gracchi and the beginning, kind of mentioning Gaius Gracchus, but I will return to it in the next lecture.